Good morning. Welcome to the last day of Afems 2021. It's been 5 long days. I just want to welcome all of you to the last day. The entire day today is going to be on Zoom and also streamed on YouTube. So you can sit in the comfort of your offices, of your home, or for those of you who are shopping as well, you can listen to us on your cell phones. So thank you so much for being here. I just want to, before I hand over to the chair of the next session, is just thank the UCT organizing team, Polo, Kanita, Nomusa, Aika, Mandisa. I hope I haven't missed anyone else, but most especially as well to the people who have helped us with the organizing of the technical stuff, because this would have not been possible. A hybrid conference, this is the first hybrid Afems. And yeah, you've made our lives a lot easier by helping us with all the technical stuff. So Jacques and your team, Yvonne, Megan, thank you so much for all the assistance that you've given us. So I'd like to introduce Professor Dinali Gaga, who is one of my co-editors of a journal we all edit together, but also a friend that has been very involved in Afems and has been at least, I think, Dina, I think at least 4 or 5 or all of our Afems organizing. So it's nice to have the OGs here, and I think it's very special that you will be here doing this chairing of the next session. And I'd like to hand over you to introduce Professor Peace Kiguwa, who we are all excited to listen to, because Peace always just comes and drops nuggets of wisdom. And so we're very excited, Peace. Well, thank you so much for all the chairing that you have done. You've taught me a lot of lessons in the way you chair and your generosity. So Dina, thank you, welcome. And I hand over to you for the next session.
Good morning. Thank you, Linda. Good morning, everybody. It's my absolute pleasure to be here and to have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker this morning. I'd like to introduce Professor Peace Kiguwa, who is an associate professor in psychology at the School of Human and Community Development at the University of the Witwatersrand here in South Africa. Her research interests include critical social psychology, affective politics of gender and sexuality, racism and racialization, and the nuances of teaching and learning. Her research projects include focus on young women's leadership in higher education in partnership with the African Gender Institute, that's the AGI, and the Destabilizing Heteronormativity Project in partnership with AIDS International. She has co-edited 3 books, UCT and Z press releases, and has published in both local and internationally accredited journals. She's currently editorial board member of 3 accredited journals and has co-edited 3 special issue journals, which I will name: Rethinking Social Cohesion and its Relationship to Exclusion, Papers on Social Representations, and Micropolitics of Belonging in Higher Education. She is the current chair of the Sexuality and Gender Division of the Psychology Society of South Africa, and recent recipient of the Oppenheimer Memorial Trust Rising Star Fellowship at Wits University. With that introduction, I would like to now invite Professor Peace Kiguwa to give us her keynote speech for this morning. Welcome, Peace.
Thank you, Dina. I'm just very quickly screen sharing here, so please let me know if you can see what I have on screen. Yes. Okay, perfect. All right. So thank you, Dina, and thank you for hosting me and that lovely introduction. I want to say good morning to everyone. Danai Mupota, thank you for your presence. Thank you for the reminder that I needed in terms of what I wanted to talk to all of you today about. Polo, Mandisa, Kanita, Nomusa, Linda, and Charlene, thank you for this space. I think the past days, speaking for myself, the past days have just been a space of beauty and healing. Thank you very much. Polo, I'm not sure if you drew the short end of the stick, but you had to liaise with me throughout in preparation for this. And I want to thank you especially for your patience and putting up with me. Tiffany, Willoughby, Herod, and Matsilo Motsei, I cannot begin to describe the honor that I feel in sharing this space with you and standing alongside you at this Afems conference. I think both of your work, your activism, and the way that you are able to provide insight in terms of the ways that we move in the world, the way that we grow into ourselves, and the way that we center love and healing is central to both of your work, and it has been an inspiration to me. So I am very deeply honored. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in, who is listening. Thank you for your time and your attention. I'm very privileged to be here with all of you, and I'm hoping we're going to have a meaningful engagement. So I want to start this keynote with a confession as well as a personal story. And my confession is that when the first invitation came from Polo, I think that was way before the pandemic, I had replied with a positive affirmative yes, that I would be happy to present a keynote. And then of course the COVID pandemic happened and we didn't have Afems. That got postponed. And when the second invitation came through, and I think, Polo, you were met with silence on my side. And the reason for the silence is that I was not in the same place that I was when I originally accepted your invitation. And the place that your second invitation found me was a place of deep despair. And there was a part of me that was very reluctant to speak about the theme of the conference, the themes related to healing, related to love, related to hope, because I was simply not in that space. And so I communicated my reservations to my partner, and in her usual and very quiet and attentive way, she settled me, and she said to me, maybe sometimes the best way to speak is from a place of emptiness. And so with that, I responded to your invitation and accepted. I am happy to say that I am not in the place of emptiness and brokenness that I was at the time of our conversation. And I think the best description I can offer to all of you today is that I am searching, and I am appreciative of this search and what it has awoken in me, but also what it has reminded me to let go of, to put down. And so that's my confession. I also want to start with a personal story, if you'll bear with me, and I will take you back to the year 2017. This was sometime in the month of February. My partner had asked that I accompany her to meet a friend of hers, a friend and colleague. She wanted to introduce me to this friend. And so we were to have lunch at the friend's home and take some time to get to know each other. This had happened just on the heels of the preceding year, 2016, in the month of October, when I had lost my friend and colleague, Dr. Lindiwe Makunga. And I was going through a slow but sure spiral into depression. 2 months after the loss of Lindiwe, I lost another colleague and friend, Ms. Nolin Pillay. And so by the time 2017 found me, I was what you would describe as a functional depressive. And that means I could do all of the work that was required of me. I could perform all of my functions and roles and responsibilities. I was a lecturer, I was a researcher, I was an administrator, I was an aunt, I was a sister, I was a partner, all of these different things. But I was working from a place of emptiness. I was interacting with people from a place of emptiness. My partner invited me to meet this friend and colleague. She could see my slow spiral into depression. It was a spiral that would eventually land me in the doctor's office, and I consulted with 3 different doctors. I had very serious difficulty breathing, and each one of them said, there's nothing wrong with you. And they just couldn't figure out what was going on with me. The very last doctor I consulted, and I don't often flag people's race and gender unnecessarily, but I will in this particular instance. The very last doctor I consulted was an Indian middle-aged man, and he eventually sat me down and asked me to speak about my loss and my heartache. And he said, that's the problem. And so with that invitation, I went with my partner to meet this friend and colleague. On the way to this person's home, she told me about her and her work, and she described her as an academic, a scholar, a healer, an activist. And I was very eager to meet this person, and I think I had built in my head someone resembling dynamite, someone who was larger than life. I would not soon forget this meeting because it was my very first encounter with Matsilo Motsei. We arrived at her home, and this person who I did not perceive as larger than life or dynamite came out to greet us and welcome us. She was definitely not what I was expecting, introduced us to her family, and essentially laid out plates of food and drink before us with the understanding that we would make some time to get to know each other and to have a conversation. So I wish I could tell you a number of things. I wish I could tell you that we had an invigorating conversation. I wish I could tell you that she comforted me in my grief and my regrets. I wish I could tell you that we came together to talk about healing and love and hope and all of those things. But I can't tell you all of that because by the time Matsilo came out to sit with us, she would find my partner and myself sprawled out on the sofa, limbs entangled and fast asleep. We stayed fast asleep until the end of the day when the sun had set. And by the time we had to leave, we did not have a chance to have a conversation. And some months after that, my partner and I would laugh about this, but in that moment, we were absolutely mortified. I have often wondered what Matsilo would make of that encounter, that first encounter. And some months later, I would meet her again at a book signing event. It was one of her book signing events. And I remember as I made my way to approach her, I remember thinking, I hope she doesn't remember me because now I get a chance to make a good impression. And by the time I got to her, she took one look at me and said, you're the one who fell asleep on my couch. The night of our embarrassing sleepover at Matsilo's home, I purchased 2 signed copies of her book, Hearing Visions, Seeing Voices. And that very night I had started reading the book. And the second chapter of that book was a letter that Matsilo had written to a friend of hers who had passed away. And it was a letter of goodbye. It was a letter that evoked the loss and the grief and the sorrow that came with her loss. And so Matsilo, in a way, you and I still managed to have a conversation that day. And I would like to say that your words, your written words were a source of deep comfort to me. And so what I would like to do today is to play host as well and to think about thinking as hospitality. And I want to play host and be in conversation with Matsilo, and I want to put her in conversation with a number of other guests that I have invited to be part of this and to help me think about feminist organizing and care. So where do I want to start? This particular quote of Matsilo's, a loving and compassionate way of being with who we are. And what she speaks to in terms of the renewal of the soul. And what I read in this quote is a refusal of the convention of what we think about when we think about theory building, when we think about community, when we think about healing, refusing the convention of the traditional roots to thinking about what it means to be free. to really insert the politics and practice of love that is central to this healing. So I want to think with you about community, and I want to think with you about care as part of this project of renewal. And I want to draw on David Grossman's short reflection on the effects of trauma as a way to start thinking about the kind of project of renewal and community building. And David Grossman tells the story of Kafka. And it's a short story about the mouse and the cat, and the mouse that is caught in the trap. And it's stuck in this trap. It's a prisoner and caged in this trap, and it witnesses this cat making its way to it, this predator. And as this predator makes its way to it, the mouse says, "The world is growing smaller every day." So I want to reflect on this increasingly small world that we find ourselves, and the void between us, the void between the individual and the violent world that we are confronted with. And to speak to this void, and I will quote directly from David Grossman here. He says, "This void does not remain empty. It quickly fills up with apathy, cynicism, and above all, despair. The despair that can fuel a distorted reality for many years, sometimes generations. The despair that one will never manage to change the situation, never redeem it. And the deepest despair of all, the despair of human beings, of what the distorted situation ultimately exposes in each of us. What the despair ultimately exposes in each of us. And so what does it mean to be confronted in this world that we find ourselves that becomes increasingly smaller? Our souls shrink. That deeply affects our capacity to love, to dream, and to imagine freedom and the way that we are able to relate with each other. This diminished capacity to empathize with other people's pain. We just don't want to know anymore. We don't want to hear about other people's stories. And so, quoting David again, "When your predator closes in on you, your world does indeed get smaller. So does the language that describes it. This language becomes flattened, and to describe this world that we live in, we resort to populist slogans, to empty cliches, to words that are nothing more than epistemic closures of the other. And so this refusal to see the other is at the heart of what I want to talk to you about. If we have to talk about community, then I guess I want to start with Maria Lugones and Pat Rozelle's idea of sisterhood and friendship. And to really center this as part of the feminist project, to center community, and in a way that is about considering the relations between us in all of its diversity. I agree with Maria and with Pat. I agree that friendship is fundamental. I agree that sisterhood is fundamental as part of community building. I agree that we need a kind of nurturance community. And so for a very long time, I've been thinking about what this could look like. So this is my first reflection. When feminist communities do indeed nurture, but when they also don't nurture. I want to think about communities in the sense of healing and the way that they can heal us, the way that they nurture us, the way that they present to us something that resembles hope. But I also want to think about communities in the way that they can be marked by brokenness and the way that they can become sources of hurt to each of us. And so to not take for granted that feminist spaces are automatically spaces of healing. I want to trouble the idea of community and to think about that in relation to care. And to speak more specifically to feminist erasures. Even now, the erasures that we find in our communities. I want to speak for a moment about the debilitating and destructive affective base of our politics and organizing that is sometimes very far from loving, very far from healing of each other. And so to consider the ways that community in many ways has been a source of pain and disappointment. And we have all at various points in our times of organizing experienced the pain and disappointment of failed community. So I want to think with you about this affective base. I want to consider the ways that we have these moments of eviscerating each other. I have been witness to the ways that we have viciously turned on each other in our moments of difference, in our moments of disagreement, in the ways that we are not able to engage our different positionalities. I have also witnessed the ways that feminist communities have been sources of sheer beauty, hope and healing, and have nurtured and continue to nurture. But I also want to attend to the ways that they can be violating spaces. Leah Naidu talks about the fragmentation that happens on a boat to Gaza amongst a group of feminists on this boat, and the way that their feminist solidarities does not hold up in the face of confrontation with the external world, in the face of violence. Francis Lee talks about the fear and the shame that exist within social justice communities, and the way that this shaming and the fear that exists within these communities has often resulted in the loss of community of each other. Loretta Ross speaks about the fear and shame that exists in the ways that we tend to eviscerate each other in the practice of trying to call each other in. And so the way that we shut down any hope, any opportunity to actually be in community with each other. And I want to speak about these affective base of rage, of hate, of melancholy and shame, and to think about these registers and the ways they are born in trauma. So what does it mean for us to come together in our woundedness? What does it mean for us to come together in our trauma? In ways that can be healing of each other, in ways that can actually be about connection and not violating and hurtful of each other. What does it mean to organize and to build community? To still attend to the ways that we are different, to the way that our bodies move about in the world through these different positionalities, but not have it to be the source of our fragmentation and the dissolution of our communities. How do we attend to this debilitating affective base? And so I want to read Matsilo Motsei's Activism and Work in conversation with the poetics of other sisters who have helped me to think through this problematic. We turn to each other. We come from histories that are so diverse. We narrate our lives with each other. That helps us to make sense of who we are and who we are in relation to each other. We think through our interior lives as well as our social lives. But I also want to think about how do we feed and what do we feed these interior lives? What is the affects that feed that? What is it rage? Is it sorrow? Is it melancholy? And in what ways is that important to the way that we think about our feminist organizing and politics? And so this poem, there is a lion in my living room. I feed it raw meat so it does not hurt me. It is a strange thing to nourish what could kill you in the hopes it does not kill you. So this need for community, but also this constant vigilance to be attentive to the ways that we can kill each other, that we can hurt each other, is what I want to think through. Audre Lorde has helped me to think about the rage, the affective politics of rage that can exist between Black women. And she says, it is not that Black women shed each other's psychic blood so easily, but that we have ourselves bled so often, the pain of bloodshed becomes almost commonplace. If I have learned to eat my own flesh in the forest, starving, keening, learning the lesson of the she-wolf who chews off her own paw to leave the trap behind. If I must drink my own blood, thirsting, why should I stop at yours until your dear dead arms hang like withered garlands upon my breast, and I weep for your going? Oh, my sister, I grieve for our gone. And this shared trauma that Lord speaks to, this shared loss and rage and melancholy, is part of the kind of register that I want to think through in terms of our rage against each other. Judith Butler has helped me to think further about rage and the effective politics of rage. Speaking from rage, she says, does not always let us see how rage carries sorrow and covers it over. How often is sorrow effectively shouted down by rage? And so this affective base of feminist organizing and community building is what has brought me into thinking about the work of Matsilo. And I think part of what we need to do is to think through what it means to theorize, because this is also part of the work that we must do. This is part of the work. So reading Matsilo and engaging her activism, I want to think about, again, what community could mean and what care could mean. And I think Matsilo's activism and her work and politics around feminist organizing, but also around community building, provides an understanding and illumination that Bell Hooks speaks to, and the ways that this allows us to act effectively, because that's the point. We want to be able to theorize so that we can act. We want to be able to understand so that we can act. And so I want to think and consider the psychopolitics of care. This is very important for me because I come from a discipline that is very fixated on interiority. And interiority is good, it's great. It helps us to make sense of who we are and who we are in the world. But I think there is a danger to fixating on interiority to the detriment of thinking about our social and political context. And so when I talk about the psychopolitics of care, I want to think through this interiority, but I do not want to shy away from the social and the political arena and the way that that is fundamental to the way that we can think about what it means to move in the world and to be in relation with each other. And so the danger of interiority, which is about neutralizing the politics of radical resistance through care, of neutralizing what community can mean by psychologizing away all of these things, and sometimes pathologizing trauma is part of what I want to try and disrupt. And so the psychopolitics of care, I want to try and understand the psychology of trauma, but to also think through the politics of that, and to read these two lenses through the registers of each other. What could care look like under racialized capitalism? What are the freeing functionalities of care? But also, what are the oppressive functionalities of care that we find? And so my third reflection is to think about a poetics of love and rage, as I find in Matsilo's care work. And I want to speak very briefly to some of the features of her work and to put these in conversation with other sisters or invited guests. And I think for me, centrally to what Matsilo's activism has been about is to try to think about care and community, but there's a certain distinction that she makes. And so she approaches care in a sense of a healing-centered approach to care, as opposed to a trauma-centered care. And I want to talk very briefly about the distinction that I make between these two. I think a trauma-centered approach to care is useful because it allows us to center trauma and our trauma. It allows us to not erase trauma. And so we are able to think about trauma in its holistic sense. But I think sometimes this is also an incomplete way that we can work with trauma because it tends to flatten. it tends to flatten who we are to our traumas. And so this is all that we can know about ourselves. And trauma-centered care then tends to work within this model of deficit and pathology. What Matsilo offers us is an approach to trauma and to healing that is about healing-centeredness. And I think this is a more holistic way to think about our histories and our presence and where we imagine our futures to be. And there are certain things that she employs in the service of this. She thinks through the spiritual and centers once again the spiritual in the project of healing. I cannot begin to tell you what this means to me rooted in psychology, because in some ways we have theorized and intellectualized spirituality out of our discipline. And so she centers the spiritual, she centers culture. She thinks through what it means to think about response through civic action and collective healing. She thinks about trauma in terms of its collective character and not just its individual character. She thinks about healing in terms of its collective character and not just its individual character. And so what I really love is that she offers us what I'm going to describe as rituals of care. And rituals in the proper sense of what we mean by rituals. What does it mean to care for each other under racialized capitalism? What is it that we have to do as part of the project of care of self and care of each other and care of our politics? She offers us an agentic approach to healing that is political. She thinks through relations to self and relations to others in a way that is about reclamation. She centers culture and identity as part of our well-being. She talks about connection to ancestors and to traditions. Matsilo's work has been work that has centered not just around women. Her work has centered around men, and sometimes it has centered around men that we would consider to be toxic and problematic. And she refuses that categorization. She wants to work for the good of community. And so she thinks about what does it mean to work even with this toxic person, this toxic perpetrator, towards the project of healing. What does it mean to imagine anew together and to reflect what it means to rebuild community? And I think she does this via the centering of a psychopolitics of care. And so she attends not only to the healing of one particular group of people, but a healing of an entire community. Her books, Healing Visions and Seeing Voices, Reweaving the Soul of the Nation, in many ways attest to this project of the collective and the individual. Her first book was trying to think through the project of healing for oneself. Reweaving the Soul of the Nation is trying to think through the project of healing for the community and the nation. And so trying to think through this effective base of healing and care. There are certain questions that I think we need to think through. We need to attend to the effective base of our activism and healing. And so that means we need to do the work of working with this negative affects that are at the heart of some of our erasures of ourselves. What does it mean to work with rage in a way that is thinking through righteous rage, which is what Matsilo does? That makes rage into a fire that cooks things rather than a fire of conflagration. What does it mean to engage in activism and her activism around gender-based violence, around masculinities, around communities, working with institutional and state entities around healing, and to try to think about ways that our rage can be about building and not tearing down? What does it mean to let go? What does it mean to work with memory? Anne Carson's poem, "You remember too much," my mother said to me recently. Why hold on to all of that? And I said, where can I put it down? And this is the other work that we must do. How do we work with trauma? How do we work with memory? How do we work with pain? Where do we put all of this? How do we work with the project of release and letting go? And so what Clarissa Estes thinking about healing and the project of healing has helped me to do is to also think about how we want to work with rage. Matsilo's work has helped me to think more pragmatically about this. Regardless of the source of the rage, something needs to happen to recognize it, to bless it, to contain it, and to release it. And through these rituals of care, and you will see in her work, she engages all kinds of ritual that have been long forgotten in our communities. But these rituals that are geared towards this project of release, of remembering, of recognizing pain and trauma and blessing it as a way to release and to let go. This reminder that we need to name our trauma, that we need to think of ourselves again in terms of a language of worthiness. You ask your heart why it is always hurting. It says, this is the only thing you will allow me to say to you, the only feeling you are willing to feel. So what does it mean to feel other emotions? The other work that we must do to ask ourselves, who are we beyond our trauma? Who are we beyond our rage? And what would be the vulnerability that is necessary to let go and to release? And so once again, as part of this psychopolitics of care, I want to think about repetition as trauma, the way that we are moved to continually repeat our scenes of trauma and woundedness. And so this project of letting go, what would that look like? So instead of trying to behave and not feel our rage, or rather than using it to burn down every living thing in a 100-mile radius, it is better to first ask rage to take a seat with us, have some tea, talk a while, so that we can find out what summoned this visitor. And by way of concluding, I want to just think through the psychopolitics of community building and care. I think feminist scholarship has offered us so much in terms of working with the politics of emotion and the way that it offers us a methodology to think about what it means to organize. But we also want to ask what is at stake for us in our social organizing and when we center affective dimensions of this. I think Matsilo's activism and her work centers the psychopolitics of care and invites us to consider this domain of the affective arrangements of feminist building and the politics of revolution and healing. And so to thank all of these people who have been part of my journeys, and to say that we have suffered the loss of each other, but we have also gained community in each other. And it is this tension that really interests me, this tension of how we may heal each other, but also this tension of how we hurt each other, and the work that needs to happen as part of building feminist communities. And with that, I thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Peace, for your amazing and insightful presentation, keynote speech. I believe that not a single one of us remains untouched by that keynote, and especially in the ways in which you bring right to the center the idea of what we were talking about a few days ago here at the conference, what Habiba Badirun called Feminist Rage. And as you were speaking, I kept thinking about how it is that these communities of care come into being, partly because a lot of the times when we come together as feminists, we want to change something. And so we are coming together in community as people who already have been hurt by something. A lot of the times we start by talking about our own work, whether it's activist work, whether it's academic work, we talk about it from the place of, I was angry at. So a lot of the times we already are in that context of pain and hurt. And when you come together with people who understand, you almost automatically want that space to be a space of care and a space of healing. But as you say quite eloquently, this doesn't always happen, perhaps for various reasons, but one of which is that unlike other job situations where we bring our professional faces in and put up the walls and protect ourselves, we don't make ourselves vulnerable. With feminist spaces, a lot of the times friendship is involved. And so therefore, because of the vulnerability, we fall even harder when things fall apart. And I think the invitation you're kind of getting us to think about and inviting us to is an invitation to think again and to name, which is something quite important. Don't take it for granted that this is what happens. We need to name it. And if we acknowledge it, then we can collectively come together and think about ways of thinking about this space, not just about activism, but also as our spaces of healing, and to acknowledge each other's pain. We all come from different locations, and we're all just trying. We're all just trying. Okay, I don't want to hold. I don't have a question for you, but I'm going to ask everyone else to just check and see if anyone has a question for you for your talk. Let me just quickly look through. So lots of gratitude. Okay, so I'll just, so Polo has a comment question. Just wanted you to speak a little bit more about rituals in community. And just to hop onto that, I heard you talk about repetition, but you were talking about repetition in trauma. And I wonder if perhaps, sorry, Polo, I'm piggybacking on yours, but if there is possibility of thinking about the healing that you speak about, which is quite hard to achieve actually, and think about as kind of practical way in which we achieve this healing. Think about repetition, not necessarily of trauma, but repetition of healing and what that would look like. Let me just check if there's any other question. Again, a lot of gratitude, very powerful dear piece. Thank you so much for bringing Machilo in conversation with us and others. Okay, so maybe just think about that. Oh, and Charlene does have a question. So do you want to just perhaps respond to the first one, or shall we just combine all of them so that you just have one go at it?
I'm willing to be guided by you.
Okay, okay. All right, so I see something from Charlene. It says, when do you sit with your rage? How do you, from a dialogue of raging repetition or an avenging repetition to healing, how do you get from that, I suppose? And Dee says, I wanted you to speak a little bit more about the potentials of the fractured relationships in these modes of community and how we rebuild and what do we do to rebuild or build anew. And like I said, clearly this is a topic that needed to come out, so thank you. Yeah, how do you move? Oh, okay, that's Charlene. All right, please.
Okay, these are not easy questions to answer because, as you rightly point out, it's very hard to do the work of healing. And so to piggyback on Polo's idea about a question about rituals and the way that I think about rituals in relation to some of the work that Matsilo has done as well. And maybe just piggyback to what you talk about in terms of thinking about repetition of healing. I think sitting with rage in some ways, so there are certain things that we do with rage. One of the things that we do with rage is that we tend to think about rage as we reclaim rage in terms of all of its affirmative, positive characteristics. right? And we know the necessity of that kind of rage. We know what it can do. We know the kinds of change that it can bring about. And sometimes this change is simply not possible if we did not exercise our rage. Matsilo talks about feeling rage in the way that the Jacob Zuma trial was unfolding. And it is this rage that brought her to sit down and to put pen to paper to think through what is it that she could do, right? So we know that kind of rage. But I think there's the other kind of rage that very often we don't talk about as feminists. And I think we need to talk more about it, because this is the other kind of rage that is debilitating to us and to our movement. This is the rage that exists between us. Silent rage that we don't name. And when we don't name it, it sits as this void. So to think about David Grossman's idea of the void. It's this void between us. And it plays out in all kinds of ways, in the ways that we eviscerate each other, we cancel each other, we do not hear each other. And so there's certain things that needs to happen. We need to name as part of this thinking through about rage. But I also think we need to think about the source of our rage. So this, I quite like this idea of sitting down with rage and offering it a cup of tea and to sit with it however long we need to sit with it, as individuals, but also as a collective. So there's the work that we need to do for ourselves, but there's the work that we need to do in community with each other. But to really sit with rage and to think about the source of our rage and what rage is actually doing for us. So that's one of the things I would say. And so this, to come to this idea of repetition of trauma and repeating the scenes of our original wounding, this is also the other work that we need to do, because it plays out in our relationship with our intimate partners and spouses. It plays out in our relationships with ourselves. It plays out at a much more broader level if you think about community. And so can we have a conversation about gender-based violence in our country that centers this original wounding as well? And I think this is part of what Matsilo recognizes in her work around gender-based violence, the recognition that we need to come together, all of us. We need to work with the ways that we have been traumatized and what it would mean for us to actually think about ourselves as worthy of love and belonging. And so she makes no distinctions about who she works with in community and in this project of healing. I'm not sure if there was another question I've left out of this.
No, absolutely. I think I completely agree with you. And I mean, I'm in awe of the fact that you were able to map this and put it down on paper and actually talk about it. Because for a lot of us, what you call the silent rage, most of us have suffered from the effects of this. And what it does is it closes up spaces for conversation, and it closes up avenues to heal and actually be stronger as a community. And as Habiba was saying the other day, it sometimes causes permanent damage. And how do you get back to that point of loving? Even though you know at the back of your mind, despite the fact that there has been a permanent fracture, this person will always be something to you that is still a source of healing. So how do we deal with that? You do have two questions, which I'll just read to you. One from Moeketsi. I would like to find out from Peace, what are her thoughts on the fusion between academic work and poetry? I'm asking in light of realizing how when I'm at a loss for words in academic writing, I often fall back to my favorite poets, Naira Wahid, Ijeoma, Umebinyo, and others. That's from, okay, so then you have another one. what does the other side of silent rage, this is from Tiffany, what does the other side of silent rage, the healed feminist relationships and the healed feminist community look like? Beautiful question. And then Polo, thank you, Polo. Polo says there's a comment from YouTube from Pelisa Nkomo. Talk about the cancel culture. It's so, so painful. We don't give each other second chances. Thank you. So yeah, those are the three kind of, yeah.
So first of all, Moeketsi, it's nice to see you. I have very fond memories of you from Wits. And thank you for your question. The very simple answer to that is, I think we need to disrupt what academic writing looks like. And of course, that means certain things. It means that there are certain consequences that come with that. You may not be published in the spaces that you want to be published, but that's okay. I think find other communities that will be receptive to these other ways of thinking about what the academy can look like. I absolutely love the ways that poetry and art, I think I've mentioned this to Habiba before, the way that poetry and art allows us to voice the emotions that the academic language sometimes just suffocates. And I have often found, I'm finding now in my writing, that this kind of conversation, so this poetics, if you will, is very useful for me in terms of helping me to think through that. So my response to you would be, go for it. Disrupt the way that academic writing can look like, and find your community that will embrace that. Tiffany, sure, that's a very good question, and it's a question that I think in many ways is still part of my own thinking, but also my hope, right? This healed feminist community, and I think there are spaces of feminists coming together, of women coming together, that have been so healing for me, and continue to be very healing for me. And so I know what that could look like. And so what looks on the other side of this silent rage, for lack of a better word, I would say it's love. It's love. And all of what love could mean. I think we had an early conversation on one of the days about whether or not love is indeed revolutionary. And I think it is. I think it is. Polo, the comment from YouTube, talk about cancel culture. It's so painful, and we don't give each other second chances. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think part of the conversation that we need to have is, it's quite a number of things here. The one is, I don't know that we can afford the luxury to cancel each other. We are up against a massive, violent, predatory world. And I don't know that we have the luxury to cancel each other. So what we need to figure out is how we can work across our differences. And that's it for me, because I think it's more than just saying we need each other. I think it's also about saying that for our politics to have any kind of meaningful effect in the world, we need to stand together, and we can't lose sight of that. Toxic patriarchy cannot be lost sight of. That's the bottom line. Yeah, so I think we need to do that work of really thinking about what it means to cancel and to erase each other.
No, you're right on point. And I think those, your responses actually speak to a lot of anxieties that exist for a lot of us. And I'm speaking also from a personal point. And just in relation to Tiffany's point, I think, Tiffany, what's the most magical thing that's happened to me with friends, feminist friends that I fell out with, has been the return. And it's from a place of acceptance. And it's just magical. It's you're no longer anxious about being, being this person or doing this thing. You come in at it from a place of acceptance and a space of humanity, where the other person, and for you as well, in the way that you look at the other person, you understand that they're both human, but that they have space for you in their hearts. It's an amazing feeling. Rarely happens, but when it happens, it's magical. There is one last question, but I think we have about just 4 minutes, if I'm reading my time correctly. So I'm just going to read this, and then feel free to answer in the way that you want to. And there's also a way in which you want to end your beautiful keynote. So Moeketsi says, on the point of gender-based violence, I'd also like to find out what does, okay, so from Peace, what does she think is missing in the conversation on GBV and femicide in the context of South Africa? A conversation that includes activists, scholars, civil society, citizens, and government. Where are we not hearing each other? And then Lee Walters, hi Lee. So she says, Prof, 2 questions, and I think I'm not going to embarrass myself. Am I correct to understand the psychopolitics of care moves in opposition to how the affective base has become commodified or codified or hardened in our everyday experiences within community? Considering that most of us live and work outside feminist community, how might we develop appropriate responses to the assault of the incompleteness of trauma in non-feminist spaces where trauma is flattened and co-opted in order to pathologize? Okay, so you can think about that as you also think about your closing statement, please. Thank you.
Okay, so can I make this my closing statement as well? And thank both of you. I think, all right. So a very simple response to that is, and I flagged earlier on that we need to be careful about the fixation with interiority in a way that flattens. And I think part of what we can do with working with emotions and affects is that we reduce that to the individual. So, we talk about intimacy, we talk about self-esteem, we talk about love and healing, but as an individual project, right? We talk about these different emotions and affects in ways that are depoliticized, in ways that remove them from the social and political contexts. We can't talk about love and not talk about the world of inequality that we live in, and the ways that influences the way that we are able to receive love, to show love and to demonstrate love. So always the affective registers needs to be thought through in relation to the social and the political. And I think that's part of the psychopolitics of care that I'm talking about. We need to think about what it means to care for each other, to care for ourselves as part of feminist community building, but in ways that attend to both the interiority and to the politics, the psychopolitics around us. And I would say that would be the same way that I want us to think about the effects of violence in our lives, whether it's gender-based violence or other kinds of violence. But one thing I would say about gender-based violence is that we also need to be wary of separating this violence from other violence in society, because that's the other thing that we do, right? So we think about gender-based violence in its spectacular form and as something distinct, but we don't talk enough about the kind of structural violence that is part of the ways that different formations of violence unfold in our society. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to say thank you to all of you, your comments, your love. I feel it. And to say thank you to Matsilo.
All right. Thank you so much for your beautiful keynote speech talk. And I'm sure a lot of us are appreciative of it. Thank you so much. And I will now hand over to Linda. I hope that's the protocol. Again, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dina and Peace. It's such a pity that we have to go on to the next session, because I am sure that there are a lot of people behind their cameras who just want to ask you more questions, want to talk to you about what you've said. And I'll just quote from the chat from Tiffany and Shalene, who say elegant, beautiful, and precious. You've given us a lot to think about, peace, and to go back to and listen to. And one of the beauties of of Afems and having these sessions recorded is that we have an archive of this, so we can take our time to just go and listen and try to begin these healing processes in ourselves. I think I'm speaking mainly about myself because that's how I feel about this. Thank you so much, Peace, for such a beautiful and what is interesting for those of us who watched the keynote yesterday from Chilo is to now have to see her in a different light, not from past experience, but how we can read her as academics, how we can use her in our own work. So thank you so much for that. Thank you so much, Dina, for sharing that session. And we are now going to go on to the 5th book launch, which is a recorded session. And it's been a pleasure to have 5 book launches at this Afems event. And the last recorded session is Barbara Boswell's book, and Wrote My Story Anyway, and she is going to be in conversation with Coco Tle. Please enjoy the pre-recorded session. We will reconvene here for the live session at 11 for the second version of the Activists in Conversation. So yeah, see you in 30 minutes.